The tale begins with Charles Bronson, the protagonist, narrating his life story. He alternates between scenes from his childhood, youth, and adulthood, as if he were performing in a theater before a live audience. While narrating, there are instances where he speaks directly to the camera, showcasing his bipolar tendencies. At times, he gazes expressionlessly at the audience, while at other moments, he comments on his desire for fame and how he was destined for greatness. The audience, however, remains unresponsive. Meanwhile, there are glimpses of Bronson being gravely wounded and trapped in a cage, engaged in a violent confrontation with security guards, indicating his aggressive nature. Despite the disturbing scene, Bronson's theatrical persona chuckles, displaying a credit card that confirms the film is based on true events. According to his comments, as a baby and toddler, there were no issues with his mind, but he started to engage in behavior as a kid that would provoke his classmates and often led to fights, which he always won. He even threw a table at a teacher and attacked him out of anger. Bronson had numerous conflicts at school, which would result in calls to his mother, but she would ignore them. Despite his violent tendencies, he asserts that he was not inherently bad, as he still adhered to his principles. He quickly accepted a position at a restaurant and occasionally engaged in theft when no one was present. Despite this, he shared his earnings with a co-worker he had romantic feelings for. Michael Peterson was his birth name, but he adopted the well-known persona of Charlie Bronson. During his younger years, authorities attempted to detain him, but Bronson would resist using physical force, including one incident where he bit off a police officer's ear. In 1974, Bronson and his former colleague Irene moved in together as a couple in a low-cost residence in England after the birth of their child. It appears that Bronson enjoyed or accepted his new family life. However, after engaging in several instances of theft and violence at a post office, he received a 7-year prison sentence, which he hoped would be reduced to 4 years. Bronson is now unable to communicate with his wife, who he never sees again. Despite common assumptions, Bronson was initially affected by his imprisonment, but quickly immersed himself in a new persona, portraying himself as a comedian in a fancy outfit, effectively becoming a clown. He viewed his cell as a hotel room, where he constantly walked in circles within the confines of the empty space, isolated from the world throughout the entire year. During one incident, he refused to do his sewing job and had a rage outburst, resulting in several guards beating him down. Despite his arrogant demeanor towards prison officials, Bronson was popular among other inmates. However, he also had unpleasant encounters with guards who assigned him to menial tasks, such as serving tea. Surprisingly, he excelled in this role and was even complimented by a fellow inmate on his strong fists, which left him stunned, as it was the first time someone had ever said something positive about him in prison. Bronson referred to himself as Britain's most violent prisoner and felt that prison was the ideal place for him. The series of newspaper articles depict Bronson as an out-of-control prisoner who desires fame. He disliked being frequently transferred between prisons but reminisces fondly about his time at Parkhurst, where he was treated like a king. Despite his numerous encounters with guards, he enjoys his current way of life, even though it led him to the mental institution called Funny Farm, where it requires 4 men to restrain him. While at the institution, Bronson convincingly portrays mental illness and undergoes compulsory medical treatments that leave him heavily sedated. During his free time, a patient attempted to discuss his inappropriate things with Bronson, who was heavily sedated and only able to babble incoherently. Despite making a few attempts to escape, Bronson was constantly subdued by the sedatives, leaving him unable to move properly. During a night party, Bronson struggled to walk and was instructed by a staff member to return to the group, but he was unable to comply. Despite his delusions of grandeur, Bronson came up with a plan to attack one of the other patients at the sanatorium to be sent back to prison. In the end, they are considered insane, and he selects the inappropriate man who had previously spoken to him. Although his attempt fails, he is given 26 years of solitary confinement, which he deems unjust, as he has never taken a life. As part of his performance, he portrays himself as a victim who was not given a fair trial, showcasing his rooftop protests and the millions of pounds in damages he caused to the system. Following these riots, he declares himself as Britain's most costly inmate and is deemed mentally fit to be released, eagerly anticipating what the world has in store for him. During his final meeting in prison, Bronson was given back his personal belongings, which included a wristwatch, a leather card holder, and a comb, which was meant because he is bald. Upon his release, he was reunited with his parents who had moved to a new house and showed him his new sleeping quarters. Bronson discovered that many of his childhood possessions had been left behind at his old home in Luton. He mentioned to his parents that his Uncle Jack knew everyone and might be able to assist him in retrieving his things. things. Bronson traveled to Luton and was greeted by his flamboyant Uncle Jack, who owned a brothel and welcomed Bronson as an exotic figure. One morning, Bronson engages in conversation with Allison, a co-worker of his uncle's. Allison admires Bronson's scars and muscles, and the two share a passionate kiss. This leads to a romantic relationship between them. Bronson's new occupation involves participating in bare-knuckle fights, which take place in small rooms and farms. He effortlessly wins most of his fights and occasionally resorts to taunting his opponents. Bronson chose to persevere despite his low initial income, even going so far as to take on multiple opponents at once and defeat them for the amusement of onlookers. Eventually, he faces off against a formidable opponent in a dog named Barnacle, whom he defeats in a single day. During Allison's reading, Bronson admits his love for her, but she confesses that she is in love with Brian, her boyfriend who owns a motorcycle. At Christmas, Bronson resorts to violent means to acquire a ring for Allison, robbing a jewelry store and knocking out a salesperson in the process. He then coerces a terrified saleswoman not to alert the authorities for 15 minutes, all while holding Allison in front of him. After telling Bronson that his lack of ambition is the reason she doesn't love him, Bronson offers her a ring. Unfortunately, she rejects his offer and decides to marry Brian instead, leaving Bronson heartbroken. Later, Bronson reveals to the audience that the saleswoman from the robbery had called the police 15 minutes after the incident, causing him to return to jail after only 69 days of freedom. When asked what he had been doing during his brief time outside, Bronson responds with a facetious answer about building an empire, which the prison governor finds foolish. Back in his cell, a guard named Andy Love leaves Bronson some reading material, but Bronson locks the door and takes Love hostage, threatening him with yelling and swearing. Bronson, aware that they will come to rescue the guard, shouts at Andy to assist him in applying petroleum jelly to his body for an easier confrontation with his attackers. Unfortunately, Bronson proves to be no match for all of them and is severely injured, leading to his transfer to a new cell while restrained. The governor warns him of his potential demise if he persists with his nihilistic mindset. However, after receiving praise from his Spanish language teacher, Mr. Daniels, in the art room, Bronson discovers a newfound joy in drawing, specifically creating depictions of birds. At the instruction of his teacher, Bronson searches for an out-of-place piece while an animated sequence depicts his disturbed thoughts. Later, he converses with the prison governor about his potential in the art field, but does not seem to accept the encouragement positively. Eventually, with the help of Mr. Daniels, Bronson reluctantly presents a sample of his artwork to the governor. Although his teacher supports his new projects, an unfortunate miscommunication leads to Bronson attacking him from behind, believing he was being exploited. Despite this, the audience still applauds Bronson's performance, though he quickly exits the stage. Soon after, he paints himself black in the art room and threatens to attack Mr. Daniels to the guards, following the violent outburst towards his teacher. Bronson requested music when the prison governor inquired about his preference from beyond the room. While classical music played in the background, Bronson kept his teacher bound and concealed under a blanket as he engaged in crafts and painted Mr. Daniels' face. Soon, Bronson believed he had completed his masterpiece. He allows the guards to enter and rescue his hostage, knowing that a battle is imminent. Despite Bronson's resistance, the guards eventually overpower him, and he falls to the ground. The screen fades to black, and text appears indicating that the actual Charles Bronson has been imprisoned for 34 years, 30 of which were spent in solitary confinement with no prospect of release. Bronson is depicted as injured and confined to a tiny cage, unable to even sit up, and is heard crying out in agony. The guards shut the doors behind them, depriving Bronson of his last breath of fresh air and leaving him completely alone. Thanks for watching.